What have you attached your own identity to? Thanks so much for listening to the Parable Podcast. I am so glad you're here. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and joining me today is pastor of Gas Street Church and co-founder of The Orchard, Rachel Hughes. She shares with us about a season of dealing with holy discontent.
And I had to overcome bitterness and resentment in order to allow God to teach me the very lessons he wanted to teach me in that season. Don't run away from it.
Here's my conversation with Rachel Hughes. I am so thrilled to introduce you to Rachel Hughes. We have jumped over the pond. She's in Birmingham, and she is just a treat. And so, Rachel, thank you so much for being with us today.
You're welcome. I always have to point out, that it's Birmingham, UK. Yes. Not Birmingham, Alabama.
No.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Okay. Well, Rachel, tell us a little bit about what gets your heart beating, what it makes you most passionate these days.
Oh, I like that question. I think more and more what I'm recognizing is God is using me to release other women into all that God has called them to do. And more than that, I get such a buzz out of doing that. It brings me so much life to see other women stepping more fully into who God's made them to be and what God's called them to do. Whether that's sort of on a one-to-one, or whether that's in a conference setting or in my local church. I love that. I really love that. And again, part of our story is we have 5 children by birth and adoption. And I love inspiring people to ask the question if God's calling them to adopt or to foster. And I think there's probably also something around, maybe a third thing around freedom, seeing people set free, which is probably connected to both in many ways. But I know for myself, I have lived with certain chains and certain limitations. And that's really a short list.
The fact that you can verbalize it, I think sometimes when people say that question to us, because we ask, like, what do we do? And we can list what we do every day. But like, truly, what is that passion that stirs in our soul? And I think that changes from season to season, but that's super helpful. I think when people hear that back from other folks and just hear, okay, yeah, like that's the same thing that is in my heart as well. What would you say you are most proud of within the last year? Something, it could be an accomplishment, or maybe it could have been a failure.
Oh, wow. I would probably say something around parenting my children. I feel really privileged in that I get to preach regularly at our church. I get to preach on various different stages and platforms. I get to pastor our church. But I think increasingly, I recognize how much loves my intentionality with my children. And I'll come on to that with my parable. I don't want to give too much away. It would be around loving my children consistently and wholeheartedly and seeing them come alive within that love.
I think sometimes when we go through life, we hold the tension of the joy, the happy, but there's also like the challenges. And so I think that we can hold both. I don't think it's an either or. What would you say that you're holding right now in this moment?
Interestingly, my husband and I are in a sabbatical season. So it looks different for both of us because, again, we have 5 children. And you can't take a sabbatical from your children because that's probably not a good thing to do. So he's taking a full sabbatical. I'm taking a partial sabbatical. I'm calling it a sabbat because it's like a half sabbatical. And essentially, the way that Tim and I operate and lead and parent together, we do a lot of tag teaming. Is that even a phrase?
Yeah, no, that's right.
So we do a lot of sharing, and likewise with a sabbatical, this is Tim's season to sort of fully rest, fully switch off from day-to-day ministry pressures. He's currently on this pilgrimage walk in Spain. Very nice.
Oh, I know that.
You know
I haven't personally been there. Our pastor went there last year.
It's a thing. I think it's like what pastors do. Yes.
Yeah.
So he's there. I am taking a sabbatical from pastoring our church. I also lead this ministry called The Orchard. So I'm carrying on with that. I'm raising our babies and keeping the home going. But I've taken a step back from local pastoring, pastoring our local church alongside Tim. And so I think for me, what I'm sitting in is just learning how to rest as an activist. I love getting stuff done.
Oh, yes.
I love getting stuff done. And that's not a bad thing. But I think I'm daily at the moment wrestling and there is stuff to be done. But I'm also given myself or created these windows right now in this season where I don't have to produce anything. I don't have to do anything productive. And it's wonderful, but also really confronting. So that's some of the tension. And referencing what you said earlier about difficulty and challenge sitting alongside all the good stuff, what you realize, and I think often these practices that the Lord instructed us at fasting, Sabbath, some of what we don't recognize in them until you practice them regularly is it's a bit like stilling the waters. Mm-hmm. And some of the stuff that has sunk to the bottom because the waters are furiously sloshing around, it's actually only when you still them that all the stuff rises to the surface. And so it's also been uncomfortable, not just because I like to get stuff done and be productive, but also it's I've got to confront that painful thought or that sinful desire or that difficult conversation that I've just sort of buried under busyness. So it's been wonderful and confronting and also quite painful, actually.
Yeah, I was on a coaching call the other day. My coach was I said, I'm going into a summer season and I just really want to rest. But my mind is like, okay, well, here are all the things that I need to do. And she reminded me that, Danielle, this is a time, even in the resting, the greatest leaders need to rest. And that is going to bring forth such fruit. And I love that picture of what you said about the water stilling and then things rising to the surface, because then our mind is truly able to be I've never dealt with that, or that's still popping up. I've just pushed it down because I've been doing. I think that is so helpful to hear that because, everyone feels that tension. Rachel, you and your sister, Amy, you both pastor churches and you started the Orchard because you wanted to gather women. But I read in your bio, you guys weren't eager about that. That wasn't something you're like, yes, let's do that. Talk to me a little bit about that journey.
I don't want to be disparaging, but we probably weren't in the Princesses for Jesus group. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We're I don't feel like a princess that needs rescuing. Mm-hmm. I'm give me the horse, give me the sword, let's go. Do you know what I mean? And again, I don't want to put anybody else down, or I think so often the gatherings that I was aware of felt like their expression of femininity was quite narrow to me. Again, and this is the whole point, is that femininity, I think, is quite broad, much broader than I think often the church allows. And this is kind of a side note. Sorry, it's like a side ramble. Okay. But it's essentially, we were not that predisposed towards sort of running women's ministries. And again, I think what I've observed, and I want to be careful, and I don't want to dishonor anybody else, because every person's calling and walk with the Lord is different. And so probably this is my prejudice as much as anything else. But I think what I observed is the man leads the church, and the wife makes the tea and the coffee and runs the women's ministry. Mm-hmm. And I have this visceral reaction to being put in a box in relation to the fact that my husband is a pastor. I love my husband. I love that he's called to be a pastor, but I feel called to be a pastor. And so to me, again, this is my own sinful, prideful nature, but anything to me that communicated being put in that role, does that make sense?
Yes.
The wife role, the pastor's wife role, I just run a mile from. Yeah. And so to me, I often saw women's ministry through that lens. And yet at the same time, my whole life has led me to gather women, whether that's in my home or, different expressions. I love gathering women together. So, God has a sense of humor. So then it was about 2019, Amy and I, so my sister, she's also a pastor. She leads a church with her husband. She's actually ordained. She's an ordained priest in the Church of England. They lead a church sort of an hour away from us. And we both felt at the same time this phrase from the Lord, it's time to gather the women. Yeah. And I was like, oh. And to be honest, my husband and I, we'd been pastoring a local church for about, 5 years by then. Mm-hmm. And every now and again, a woman would come up to me and say, when are we going to start a women's ministry? And I'd be like, no, we're not going to do that. Because to be honest, again, this is more revealing of me than it is a judgment on anyone else. But my understanding of women's ministry is it was a space for women to lead and to teach and to preach because they weren't allowed to do it in real church. And so actually that wasn't our church. Mm-hmm. Our church, in fact, we have an abundance of amazing female leaders in our church because our church models that. I'm the pastor, Tim's the pastor. Women lead in every sphere of our church. They are as visible on the platform as the men, perhaps even more so. So I'm like, well, we don't have a need for women's ministry because it's happening in real church. Yeah. But God is so funny, isn't he? He's so persistent. So we both, I was like, Ainsley, it just won't go away. I know God said it's time to gather the women. And she's like, me too. And we thought we might do that separately. Then my sister and I, we are super, super close. We love working together. We're very different, but we work well together. So we're like, should we do it together? So we hosted this gathering right at the beginning of 2020. Like literally, we were the last event that happened before the church closed its door. And it was just the most electric. I mean, the presence of God in the room was unreal. And just that gathering of women, it was undeniable. God's hand, God's favor, a blessing was on it. And there was a hunger. The tickets just flew. And so we're like, oh, okay, I think there's something in this. And I think what I recognized is that there is something that happens in the room when women gather. God does something specific. I don't know why that is, but I couldn't deny it. Anyway, fast forward 4 years, and we're about to have our fourth conference in October, and we've now extended to 2,500 women in Birmingham. We're gathering just under 1,000 women in London. We're doing events in Australia. We're doing this podcast. So it's all just kind of kicked off, much to our own okay. We're following what the Lord is doing.
When you were talking about femininity, I mean, there's a spectrum there. You see that in the Bible. You see that in different women. And to have now you're being called to this space to say like, hey, there is a space for all of us. It doesn't have to be about crafts. It doesn't.
I'm terrible at crafts. I'm terrible. I've taken up knitting. I do like knitting, but
just to have that, I think I led women's ministry for 12 years and I'm able to preach at our church. Like, I love that. And so that wasn't my only opportunity, but there was this deep sense of community and like knownness, if that's a word, when we met, just to see and like connect and understand. Yeah. And just breaking those walls down and having conversation. So that's beautiful, Rachel. I'm so excited for you just to see the continued expansion and where you guys are going. That's amazing. I'll come to Australia if you need me.
Yes, come. Come to Australia.
All right. Well, Rachel, the thing that I love about parables and how Jesus shared them is that there's just this piece inside each and every story where we can unlock and realize the lesson. And so I'd love for you to share with us one of your parable stories today.
I have really struggled to pick one, but I'm going to go with the one that first came to my mind because that is often how God speaks. And then I sort of second guess myself. I'm like, no, I'm going to go with the first thought that came into my mind. And it was right back now 16, 17 years ago when I was about to give birth to our first child. And I want to say, first of all, I know that there will be women listening to this whose desire is for children and it hasn't happened. And I want to be really sensitive to that. So as I share this, I don't want there to be any sense of ingratitude for the gift of children. I've journeyed infertility with friends, and I know how painful it is. And so I guess, in a sense, I just want to say that up front, that I know that for some, there would be a longing for children and it hasn't happened. But the transition for me from not being a mum to being a mum was, I mean, everything that I hoped it would be. I fell head over heels in love with our daughter, Phoebe, our number one. And she was and is the most beautiful human being. But I found the transition in terms of my identity really, really hard. And the reason I think God spoke so profoundly to me, and the reason I feel compelled to share it, is because I don't actually think it gets talked about very often. I feel like with sort of transition to motherhood, there's often like these two ends of the spectrum. You hear all the lovely, wonderful, isn't it amazing, my life is now complete stories. Or you hear the really tragic, sad stories of women who have battled with their mental health and postnatal depression and everything. But for me, it was like a holy, beautiful, but really challenging surrender to my identity. Because, I mean, I cried every day after she was born for 6 weeks. I don't cry that much. I didn't have depression. I wasn't struggling to bond with her. I was just so overwhelmed. And as I've mentioned before, like, I get stuff done. Like, I have high capacity. I'm not like a wilting little flower. I can manage stuff. And I'm like, this is so hard. Where's the manual? Nobody told me it to be so hard.
No one tells you, yes.
No. But also, we live in a society that is so, dishonoring is too strong, that just doesn't have a framework for recognizing how precious and important that motherhood season is. And I think that was what I found hard, is that I'd always had sort of a career that I enjoyed talking about, that I could go to a dinner party and say, oh, well, I used to work in television. Oh, let me tell you about it. And now I work for this sort of big successful church in London. Let me tell you about it. Honestly, at a dinner party, nobody wants to sit next to the stay-at-home mum. They really don't. And so I think what I recognized in myself was, wow, I have attached so much of my identity to what I do.
Yes.
And so not only was I finding it really hard that I'm like, I've got to care for this. This is exhausting. Like, what about my needs? Gosh, when you become a mother, it is death to self. People don't tell you that. Like, it is death to self. And that is a really good thing. I think that's part of the lesson, was the Lord's like, actually, when you can die to yourself in order to care for another, you are doing something so beautiful. I love that when you do that. So it was recognizing that in caring for my children, we then went on to like pop out several other children in quite quick succession. And so essentially I was kind of at home caring for little ones for 7 years. And I guess the parable moment, the sort of the message in all of that the Lord wanted to speak to me was around seasons of life. And I think in ministry terms, I felt like I was on hold because pre-having children, I just started preaching. I mean, very, very badly, but I had started to do a bit of preaching. I was on the leadership team at church and I was enjoying that. And so I was like, okay, I'm at home, I'm having children. I'm literally like pureeing food. I'm wiping up poo. I'm blowing snotty noses. I'm standing in the play park, like I'm on hold. This is one of those on hold. And then when the children, are old enough, they're off to kindergarten or school or whatever, I'm back into ministry.
Yeah.
And I just, over and over and over again, I felt the Lord say, I don't do on hold seasons.
Yeah.
And I think the biggest lesson within that is that God was at work in me. That, yes, of course, God was at work in the lives of my children. He was using me in these, wonderful ways, sacrificial ways to care for my children. But I think what I recognize is that in the hiddenness, in the denial of self, in the monotony of it all, God was cultivating this gold within me that I knew was going to set me up for future seasons. That actually I could have rushed it. And again, I'm not making any judgmental statements about how anyone else raises their children, but I could have rushed back to work quicker than I did. And for me, everyone's situation is different. I want to be really clear about that. But for me, I'm so glad I didn't. Maybe because there was more work to be done on my character than other people. But for me, the refiner's fire of being at home with small children, there's nothing like it. In my experience, not everyone will go through that, but for me. And then I think what I recognize is that there is a plan for each season. And the lie of the culture is that you got to try and do it all, do it all in one go. And I just don't think the Lord works like that. And so I think what I've really learnt to sit in is this is what I'm called to for this season. And this season might be a year, it might be 5 years. So for instance, I know I've had these prophetic words given to me over and over again about writing a book. And I've had various different conversations. And I wonder if one day that will happen. And the flesh part of me is like, oh, do it now. Find the time to do it now. I just know it's not for this season. Yeah. I've got a toddler. I've got 3 teenagers. I'm pastoring a church. I'm leading this ministry with my sister. Like, this is not for this season. Yeah. Maybe I won't write a book until I'm 70 years old. Yeah. That's okay. Like, that might be what God has for me in that season. And I think a life parable for me that the Lord has taught me over again, specifically in that season with young children, is every season has a plan and a purpose. Just sit in it. Yeah. Allow God to teach you in it. And it could be multiple things. It doesn't have to be one thing. Yeah, it's been profound for me.
I mean, that hits hard, Rachel, because I think the seasons of life, wrestling with identity, what I have to do versus what others or God wants me to do. I mean, that is something that I think many of us struggle with, whether you're a mother or not. Like that identity, I've run into that so many times where we see ourselves as our occupation or our role. And I just think about like, well, if that is stripped away, then who am I really? I'd be curious during that time. Obviously, you shaped this into this parable now. You have 7 children. When would you say that you started like owning that and realizing that for yourself? Because you said you're standing on the playground. What am I doing here? How long has that been a constant journey? Or is that like, 3 years in, I kind of figured it out?
Yeah, good question. I think I'm still learning it. By the way, 5 children. You just added 2 extra children. So I hope that wasn't prophetic. But don't tell my husband. He will not.
7 total. 7 total in your family. That's where I'm going. Yes.
I think I began to learn it probably by my 3rd child, Lois. Okay. I was like, okay, I'm in this. And actually, I was beginning to find real purpose within it. And God spoke to me very clearly just after my 3rd child was born that, again, I was to gather mums. And I sensed that there was a space for mums to gather, to connect with one another, to connect with God, and to connect into their local community. Because I'm an evangelist at heart. And I'm like, this is the most incredible season for meeting other people outside of church. And my life had become, the season before had become very church oriented. It's like, wow, I'm meeting all these mums who are open to new friendships. In fact, statistically, becoming a parent for the first time is one of the most spiritually open times of your life. Wow. Where you're open to new relationships, you're open to new ideas, you've got this new little being that you've got to care for. And so I saw a number of mum friends become Christians, give their lives to Jesus in that season. And I began to find real purpose in it. And I had incredible friendships, really deep friendships with other mums who were in the same season. But, I'd say it really landed for me. It really hit home. We'd had our 4 birth children in quite quick succession. Our youngest at the time, he started kindergarten at sort of 3. And I started pastoring the church with Tim at about that time. And I did that for the next 5 years. And then God really spoke, well, he'd already been speaking for a long time about adoption. I just knew we were meant to adopt. Tim has a different version of this story because it took him a little longer to get there, with me praying frantically in the background. And he then also recognized that this is something that we were to do. And so, long story short, we ended up fostering a 1-week-old baby. And the plan for this little one was for her to remain in our family permanently. Again, depending on how all the courts and everything over here, it's a different system. And I was then back in the hidden season.
Yeah.
So I'd had 7 years at home with the bio kids. I was in sort of visible ministry, 5 years preaching, leading, managing people, all of that. And then I knew God was calling me to go back into the hidden space of sleepless nights, changing nappies, caring for this. And because I'd learnt the lesson in that first time, I willingly went back there. And to be honest, there were moments when our little daughter, she's now 3.5, where I'd be up all night. She didn't sleep very well. She doesn't sleep very well. She's gorgeous. She's absolutely gorgeous, but she doesn't sleep very well. I remember I'd be up rocking her in the middle of the night thinking, no one will ever know this. No one's going to see this. No one's going to write me an email to say, wow, I just love the way you rocked your baby daughter all night last night. But I just knew I was exactly where I wanted to be. And in many ways, it was kind of like a major backstep career-wise.
Sure.
I'd started to preach in different places and whatever, but I was like, I just know this is the season. Mm-hmm. This is the season. And if God wants me to preach again, I'll preach again. Mm-hmm. But right now, my primary focus is I'm going to love this little girl with every fiber of my being and trust that whatever God has in future seasons, he'll make it so. And so that was when I really knew at that moment.
Beautiful. What is her name?
Her name's Summer. Oh, she is heaven. Oh, my goodness.
Oh, that's so sweet. How did it come to be that adoption was even in your wheelhouse? You already had 4 kids. And what was that stirring? Has it been a part of your whole journey, your whole life, thinking, okay, I think this is a possibility? What was the tipping point for you?
I think I've known ever since I was a child. There was this TV advertising campaign. It sounds so crazy, but it was actually really, now I think about it, I don't know if they'd be able to put it on TV anyway, but it was for a charity that supports children who are essentially in abusive families. Yeah. And I remember it's a very brilliantly done advert raising awareness for abuse, because this is, I'm old. This was 35 years ago when there wasn't so much awareness around it. And I watched it and it suddenly occurred to me, I was probably maybe 8 years old, and it suddenly occurred to me that there were kids who were in families and they weren't safe, that there were parents that could neglect or abuse their children. And I sobbed and sobbed and sobbed. I can remember it so well. And I just knew at that moment God put in my heart that I needed to be part of the solution somehow. And I wouldn't have known then that it was adoption. But even before I met Tim and we got together, I always thought, I think adoption is part of the story. And then we had our 4 birth children and we planted a church and our hands were really full. I mean, really full. But this desire to adopt, it hadn't gone away. If anything, it intensified to the point where I was like, Lord, you are going to have to do something about this desire, or you're going to have to change Tim's heart. I cannot live with this anymore, or find another way for me to do something. I cannot carry the burden of this without actually doing something. And then, actually, Tim, I love this bit of the story because the Lord's, having resisted quite a lot, Tim felt God say to him, you've got to trust Rachel's instincts on this. Thank you, Lord. So he was like, I think you're right. Oh, I love that. And we went for it. And then, of course, the minute he held Summer in his arms, he was a total goner. There was no going back after that.
So sweet. For somebody who is maybe struggling in that holy discontent of identity, or maybe just not feeling seen, or is this time of my life, it doesn't matter. What would be your encouragement to step into surrender for themselves?
I think it's so important. And again, I think we have to resist the narrative of the culture that says mitigate against any sense of discomfort. You're worth it. Do you know what I mean? You are the center of your universe. If it's not working for you, get out, find something. Like, we are fed this narrative that says make everything about you. Is this meeting your needs? Is this fulfilling your dreams? Da, 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 da. And I think it is a really dangerous narrative. It's so the antithesis of really what the Lord is wanting to teach us. Take up your cross and follow me. So I think if you're in a season where you feel unseen, it's hard, what's the point? You are in really good company. Like, I love the story of Joseph, particularly. I mean, let's bear in mind that his hidden season was in a dungeon. Do you know what I mean? Like, let's get it into perspective. He was like a slave in a household. But I think what's so powerful about his story is we can skip to the good bit where he's promoted into Pharaoh's household, where he is basically like made president. He has children, he gets married, he's reunited with his father. We forget that he spent 13 years as a slave in a dungeon, but those 13 years were never wasted. Yeah. In fact, that's what Joseph alludes to. You meant it for evil, he says, but God meant it for good. And again, I'm not comparing being at home with small children. I've got to be careful there. But I do think hidden seasons have lots of different shapes and forms. And it so depends on how you're feeling about it. For some people, being at home with children is like, woohoo, this is what I've been made for. I'm like, I totally get that. I love that too. But I suppose, if you're feeling undervalued, overlooked, trust you're in good company, but trust that God is at work in you, if you allow it. Because the danger, and I definitely fell prey to this, the danger is you get so wrapped up in disappointment, which leads to cynicism, which leads to bitterness, which leads to resentment. And you can sit in that space and you can completely miss what God is trying to teach you. And I had to overcome bitterness and resentment in order to allow God to teach me the very lessons he wanted to teach me in that season. Don't run away from it. Don't rush out of it. Again, the voice of the culture will say, oh, if it's not like whatever it might be, run away, get out of it, do something for you. When the Lord might be saying, no, I want you to sit in this. Don't rush on from it. Allow me to complete the lesson here. And that was certainly, for me, that was certainly true for me.
The funny thing, Rachel, is when after you've shared your whole parable story, and the first question I asked you is like, what gets your heart beating? You had talked about, the calling to adopt, setting women free, chains, and intentionality. I mean, that is just truly like all a part of this story. And I just think that's so beautiful how God weaves those passions and the desires of our heart through the lessons that he has taught us. You talked about intentionality, and I'd love to kind of hear what that looks like for you as a parent, what that looks like for you as a wife, just intentional between you and your relationship with God.
Funnily enough, my word for 2023 was intentionality, because I can be one of those people that's great at starting stuff, but I'm not always very good at sort of sticking to it. And I really wanted to have better intentionality. I think one of the big things for me in our family was recognizing how important culture setting is. And it was interesting, you see, within our church, Tim and I had done all this work around the culture. Do you know that famous quote that says, culture eats strategy for breakfast? It says, You can have a great plan. You can have a great plan. Like, the strategy is getting people from A to B. But if the culture's off, you're not going to get there. It's going to be miserable for people. And I recognized that we'd done all this work creating, like articulating what we wanted the culture to be in our staff team and putting stuff in place. Values, listing off the values to create a great culture. I was like, man, we need to do this with our kids, with our family. We need to articulate the kind of culture that we want to create in our family. And so we just came up with a set of values that we wrote down and stuck them on the fridge and referred back to. And they kind of spelt out our last name, which was convenient. But it was really, really powerful to be able to say, hey, was that our values? You know, when you hit your brother, or, you know, I mean, obviously that never ever happened. Or when you said that thing, you know, is that our values? Or when you know, left the table without clearing your dishes away. I don't think that's about, or the other side is, hey, that was so our values. I loved how you did that.
Yeah.
Because we want to create a family where people feel safe and loved and are able to thrive and flourish. And so I think that's one area that I've tried to be intentional. There are lots of other little ways.
Yeah. Oh, that's so good, Rachel. Thank you for kind of walking us through that. Well, I just have greatly appreciated this conversation. It hits home, and I'm just thankful for you and your ministry and just for your willingness to share. If people wanted to get connected to you, what would be the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, either I'm on Instagram, love Instagram. I don't even know what I am. I don't know. Rachel Hughes. I don't know, something. I'm there somewhere. But then The Orchard is probably a good place, theorchardwomen.com. And we do this podcast and this conference that's over here, the other side of the pond.
Awesome. Well, all of Rachel's information will be available in today's show notes. Rachel Hughes, thank you so much for being on the Parable Podcast.
Thank you for having me. What a pleasure.
I love that Rachel shared a little bit about the transition of motherhood. And really, I think you can relate this to any season where there's this difficulty and a season of self-sacrifice and growth. It allows me such comfort to know that every season has a plan, has a purpose, and sometimes rushing through or trying to do it all is not how God works. He really is taking that time to cultivate and mold us into the person that we're becoming. To connect with Rachel or to listen to any of her preaches from The Orchard, visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Rachel. Number 1, what are areas in your life that you have currently attached your identity to? And how can God use that to allow you to surrender more in your own life? Number 2, Rachel talked a bit about this in the end with her family, but really, what are your values? Maybe take some time to journal through that. What is that for yourself, your family, your job? I think setting some of these clear boundaries helps us give guidance to the choices, the decisions, the opportunities, and the hardships that come our way. If you haven't already, an easy way to support the Parable Podcast is simply by subscribing to wherever you listen. Also, a huge shout out to my talented husband, Eric, for his editing expertise today. That's going to do it. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable is how God uses the hidden seasons for good. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.